Okay, today is June 5th, 2022, and we have a very special guest back on the show today, Gerald Horne. Dr. Horne currently holds the Moores Professorship of History and African American Studies at the University of Houston. Dr. Horne is an activist, scholar, researcher, archivist, author, historian, and much, much more. Dr. Horne, by my count, has written at least 46 books and is considered one of the most prolific history authors of all time. Dr. Horne's most recent book, which was published just a few weeks ago, is entitled The Counter-Revolution of 1836, Texas, Slavery, and Jim Crow, and the Roots of American Fascism. It can be found at all the major bookstores, and we recommend supporting Esawan Books bookstore. That's ESO space WON bookstore, and we recommend purchasing all of your books there if possible. Dr. Horne is also interviewed almost daily on a broad range of topics, including current events. You can find Dr. Horne's interviews and lectures and latest writings on Facebook and YouTube. You can also check out the Gerald Horne 9-part biography series on this YouTube channel. Dr. Horne also hosts a radio show entitled Freedom Now, which airs on KPFK 90.7 FM on Saturdays at 11 a.m. Pacific Standard Time, and it can be also found on kpfk.org. It is without a doubt the best radio show in all of the land. Dr. Horne, welcome back to the show. It's a pleasure to have you back.
Thank you for inviting me.
Well, when you were last on the show in January 2022, you essentially predicted much of what we've seen over the course of the past 6 months, particularly with regards to the changing global correlation of forces. So I was hoping you could review the major events of the past 6 months and discuss what lies ahead and potential long-term historical implications.
Well, let's start with February 4th, 2022, the meeting in Beijing between President Putin and President Xi, this remarkable 5,000-word statement, which suggested that this was a relationship without limits, their words, not mine. That was followed on February 24th by the, quote, special military operation of Russian forces into Ukraine, which is going on as we speak. And it bids fair to create a new balance of forces globally, although I'm not able to say definitively that will be the case. What I mean is that with the apparent backing of Moscow by Beijing, you have what could be called Henry Kissinger's nightmare. Recall that approximately 50 years ago, indeed in February 1972, you had the Entente between Washington and Beijing on an anti-Soviet basis. That was seen as a diplomatic masterstroke by Washington. It came in the midst of a number of revolutions in Nicaragua, Grenada, Iran, and it seemed as if US imperialism was on the back foot. But with the deal with China, the United States was able to effectively encircle the then Soviet Union. Recall that today's Russia and today's China probably have more neighbors bordering it than other countries on planet Earth, 14 in each case. And so what this means is that this creates enormous opportunities for their antagonists to encircle them and to, for example, help to wean Ukraine towards the NATO bloc, for example, to weaken Russia. So what happens is that this was seen as a diplomatic masterstroke, but in return for this alliance, China got a sweet deal. They got massive direct foreign investment into their economy from the United States and its allies, which has created this juggernaut, which by some measures has already surpassed US imperialism. Just the other day, China rolled out its passenger jet, which will be challenging both Boeing and Airbus of Western Europe. And so now the way I interpret this conflict in Central and Eastern Europe is that it's only stage one of an attempt by US imperialism and its allies to really get to the big burrito, the big enchilada, which is the People's Republic of China. That is to say, that rather than confronting China directly, they're going to attempt to weaken China's major ally, the ally without limits, to quote the February 4th statement. And then, if the best case scenario of imperialism works out, eventuates, if you look at the current issue of the Atlantic magazine, you'll see an article that suggests that Russia should be broken up. It'll be the final, quote, decolonization, quote, on process. And therefore, you would have even more antagonists of China on its borders. So China obviously recognizes this. And what's happening now is that a sort of new balance of forces is being created. I recommend that your viewers and listeners pay attention to the trade relationship between Russia and China. It's gone up 1,000% with regard to trading in their own currencies, the ruble and the renminbi yuan, in the past 5 or 6 months. The sky is the limit with regard to that kind of trade, and that will obviously call into question the continued primacy of the US dollar. And of course, Russia is also trading its oil for Indian rupees. And speaking of India, that should also remind us is that despite the propaganda of US imperialism, it's not clear, to put it mildly, that the world is actually behind Washington and NATO. Look at India, look at China, look at the global South, look at the African Union, for example. Because I think that particularly concerning Africa, there is a growing recognition that to the extent that the North Atlantic allies boycott Russian energy, they'll have to turn towards African energy. Already you see Algeria playing Spain off against Italy with regard to its natural gas, Algeria's natural gas, a turnabout from colonial times when the European powers played off one African nation against the other. They'll have to rely more on Nigerian petroleum, Angolan petroleum, South African gold as opposed to Russian gold, South African titanium necessary for advanced jets, of which Russia has in profusion, South African palladium, which of course Russia also has in profusion, necessary for catalytic converters, essential for the green economy. They're attached to automobiles and are a major item of theft by many who are seeking to turn a quick buck by attacking parking lots. And so this is the state of play. And you also see that same trend in Africa manifested in Latin America, particularly with the Summit of the Americas, which will be commenced in Los Angeles in a few days, where the Mexican president is boycotting. And of course, he's too lukewarm with regard to sanctions. Speaking of Lopez Obrador, and he's boycotting because Cuba, Nicaragua, Venezuela are not invited. Keep a close eye on Mexico as well, because if you paid attention to Lopez Obrador's recent trip to Cuba, you saw the glimmerings, the outlines of a new hemispheric power, speaking of the largest Spanish-speaking population on planet Earth, that is to say Mexico, leading other Latin American nations in league with Cuba in particular. It reminds me of the V-shaped formation of geese that you see in the sky, with Mexico at the point and Cuba on its left flank, and its other flank, Venezuela, and perhaps after the Brazilian elections, perhaps even after the Colombian elections, followed by left-wing governments in both of those South American giants. So once again, we may, and underline may, be on the cusp of this shift in the global correlation of forces. But as of June 5th, 2022, it's difficult to state that proposition definitively.
Yeah, and speaking of the changing global correlational forces and the Summit of the Americas, my understanding is that it wasn't just Mexico, or isn't just Mexico that's boycotting. It's also the entire Caribbean nations, if I'm not mistaken, and I believe other countries. Um, and speaking of kind of other movements that we're seeing, what have we seen in terms of Haiti's relationship with the African Union, in terms of BRICS expansion? Can you speak to those viewpoints?
Yes, and I should say now what I should have begun by saying, which is that sadly and unfortunately, many wonder why people like myself spend so much time studying global events. And I think the answer is clear. One is that if you look at history, particularly the history of slavery and the history of Jim Crow, US apartheid, neither would have retreated but for global alliances by Black people in the first instance. And one of the problems we face today is a failure to think globally. And second of all, that's tied to the other point, which is that the right wing is so strong in the United States of America. So if you're trying to make progress, inevitably you have to lengthen the battlefield. You cannot expect to advance just by struggling within the four corners of the United States of America. You have to internationalize the question, which brings us to Haiti, which, if prognostications are accurate, will be joining the African Union sooner rather than later as a representative of the African diaspora. This is per a recent interview I saw on South African broadcasting by the Haitian ambassador in Pretoria, South Africa, Jacques Junior Baril, if I'm not mistaken, is his name. And if that takes place, then that opens all sorts of possibilities. For example, Haiti being the connective tissue of the diaspora to the surging African Union. Surging in the sense, given its clear and advancing relations with both Moscow and Beijing, and given the fact that it's being courted assiduously, not only by Moscow, Beijing, the North Atlantic powers, but also by India, Turkey, Brazil, and other emerging powers. So this opens up the possibility of more human rights investigations of the United States, focusing on police terror, focusing on killings of Black people, which have grown spectacularly in recent years. The most recent outrage being in Buffalo, New York, just a few weeks ago. And I think that the possibility that that Argentina will be joining the BRICS, Brazil, Russia, India, China, South Africa, also is a very welcome development that strengthens this alternative. Already, you can see a number of alternative formations that bid fair to be stiff challengers to US imperialism and its allies, not only the BRICS, but the Shanghai Cooperation Organization, which, to put it simplistically, is a kind of counterpart to the North Atlantic Treaty Organization headquartered in Shanghai, as is evident from the name. And it also has close relations with Iran and developing close relations with Pakistan. Recall that Pakistan's Prime Minister Imran Khan was just chased out of office, he claims, by US imperialism. Many people in Pakistan have been on the march as a direct result. And then there's the Eurasian Economic Union, headed by Moscow, which co-ops not only former Soviet republics such as Kazakhstan, but also Armenia, interestingly enough. Just a footnote on Armenia, there's an influential Armenian diaspora in California in particular, particularly in Glendale. The former governor of California, George Dugmasian, was Armenian. And I need not mention the Kardashians, who are, of course, Armenian. Interestingly enough, when the former spouse of Kim Kardashian, Kanye West, traveled to Armenia. He did this in the aftermath of talking about slavery, of Black people being a choice. So I expected him to emulate that by saying that when the Turks commenced to inflict genocide on the Armenians about 105 years ago, that was a choice by the Armenians. But somehow he did not manage to articulate that controversial viewpoint. And with regard to Haiti, keep in mind as well that you had two important summits that are auguring well for the future. One in Mexico, featuring Caribbean nations and Latin American nations, once again under the aegis of Lopez Obrador. And then just before that, this is all in late 2021, a CARICOM African Union virtual summit with President Kenyatta of Kenya, President Ramaphosa of South Africa, communing with their Caribbean counterparts, such as Prime Minister Mia Mottley of Barbados. So there are some very positive signs, but let me caution listeners that in the 1970s, we also saw many positive signs, reference what I said a moment or two ago about these revolutions erupting in Nicaragua, in Grenada, Iran, etc. But US imperialism was able to come back with a vengeance. And so it's too soon to sound the tocsin for US imperialism. At the same time, I think it's fair to say that confronting this Russia-China bloc is something new, particularly when we consider that disrupting that bloc by Henry Kissinger in 1972 was the precondition for the surging comeback of US imperialism. And it does not appear as if US imperialism will be able to drive a wedge between these two giants, but let's not count our chickens before they're hatched, as they say in the United States.
Yeah, and the other question I wanted to talk to you about today is the gun violence that we're seeing in the U.S. And you had mentioned earlier that the anti-Black violence that occurred in Buffalo, the massacre that occurred in Buffalo, and then not far in the state that you reside in Uvalde, Texas. There was a shooting there, and so a lot of my viewers have been asking me to ask you about the historical roots of gun violence that we're seeing today. So I wanted to get kind of your take on everything that's going on in the historical backdrop.
Well, what I find striking is that in the United States, there is a studious ignoring of the most salient factors with regard to explicating this rampant gun violence. Number one, that this is a settler colonial project based upon a European invasion hundreds of years ago. That's the essence of the book over your right shoulder, I believe, The Dawning of the Apocalypse, The Roots of Slavery, White Supremacy, Settler Colonialism, and Capitalism in the Long 16th Century. And by dint of weaponry, London was able to forge a cross-class alliance between poor and middle strata and affluent European invaders, pan-European invaders, unlike Catholic Spain, which had a first mover's advantage insofar as it sponsored Christopher Columbus, but then devolved into religious sectarianism where one had to be Catholic in order to feast at the colonial table. London improvisationally opted for pan-Europeanism, i.e. whiteness, i.e. white supremacy, and by dint of developing a precursor to today's military-industrial complex, that is to say, developing a weapons industry in order to fight the Scots, the Irish, the Welsh, and then continental neighbors, England was able to then transfer that technology to North America with devastating impact upon the indigenous population. We're able to transfer that technology to Africa, helping to grease the skids for the unlimited African slave trade. And then once the settlements were established, you see that there is this fervent wish, oftentimes implemented, to make sure that guns do not reach the hands of the indigenous or the Africans. And that's the meaning of the vaunted and fabled Second Amendment to the US Constitution, number 2 on the vaunted and fabled Bill of Rights, signaling its importance in my estimation, which in some sense you could say was designed to create a so-called well-regulated militia, but a well-regulated militia would oftentimes be used to suppress revolts by enslaved Africans and by the indigenous population. And so it became a priority to have these weapons distributed profusely, and in a sense that worked, unquote. I'm speaking to you from Texas, and as you mentioned, my latest book on Texas, about 200 years ago, Texas was teeming with Comanches, with Kiowa, with Caddo, with Mescalero Apaches, Lipan Apaches. After these settlers were finished, there were hardly any of them left, I'm afraid to say. And so this helped to create a culture of violence, a culture of weaponry that still manifests itself, and then has the contemporary accents that the right wing, which, as noted, is formidable in this country, has the idea that they do not want any gun controls, perhaps even gun safety regulations, because from their point of view, not my reading of them, but their own words, that if a government comes to power in this country that they object to, they want to have the means and the ability to shoot them out of power, quite frankly. And reference now the January 6, 2021 attempted coup, where the latest news reports suggest that the 45th US president was willing to liquidate the US Vice President, Michael Pence. So then there's the political economy aspect. This is a very profitable industry that sends what has been described as a river of weapons into Mexico, often into the hands of so-called drug cartels, send a river of weapons into Haiti, sending a river of weapons all over the world, making for fat profits. And then we know that the gun lobby is a major bulwark of the party of whiteness, speaking of the Republican Party, giving millions of dollars to Mr. Trump, amongst other right-wing no-goodniks. And so when you put all of these factors together, you begin to understand why the right wing has made the calculation that massacres are just a cost of doing business, that killing 10-year-olds is just a cost of doing business. I mean, you have to break eggs to make omelets. This is the price that must be paid in order for those foregoing priorities of keeping this white supremacist settler colonial regime in power intact. Which, of course, then brings us to the philosophy of so-called replacement theory, this idea that there is this apparent cabal that wants to replace the hardworking Euro-Americans with Haitians and Mexicans, et cetera. And therefore, as in El Paso, Texas, a few years ago, at a Walmart, in Buffalo, New York, at a Tops Market, these young Euro-American men who are drunk and intoxicated on these beliefs feel it's their duty, their sacred duty, to kill people who are not defined as white. Now, I would also make the further point that this hysteria that you see on the right, and particularly you witness with the gunmen in Buffalo and El Paso, I would also argue ties into the previous point, which is the looming specter of China being the leading nation on planet Earth, a turnabout from centuries previous, when it seemed as if London, then Washington, had a lock on global hegemony. And now, after spending trillions on a Cold War, supposedly against communists, you have this largest political organization on planet Earth, speaking of the Communist Party of China, with 95 million members, apparently getting into the pole position. Just a footnote there, I recall after 1989 and 1991, when you had the collapse of the Soviet Union, and all of the bourgeois commentators were chortling and celebrating about the death of communism, quote unquote. And as I looked around, I still saw communists in power in Cuba and Vietnam and North Korea, and of course in China. So I said, are these people just spiking the football at the 30-yard line? Or is this just some sort of wish fulfillment that they say it long enough and loud enough that the message then will be disseminated, and then China will, as they used to say in the Western movies, come out with their hands up and surrender to Matt Dillon? Well, apparently not. And I'm afraid to say that this is just one more reason why we need to lengthen the battlefield and have more international scrutiny of the United States of America, given these ideological excesses I've just mentioned, and given these mass killings by white supremacists.
Yeah, the other question I wanted to ask about gun control is the left's response or lack of response. And it seems to me that the left is in three different camps. The first camp being more gun control. The second camp being armed, that there shouldn't be gun control, so that there's some sort of armed self-defense, a la the Black Panthers, a la the American Indian movement, and the other liberation movements we've seen in the country, and even, Grandmaster Jay, for instance, in more contemporary times. And then the third kind of approach that I've heard is the abolitionist approach, is that, in this movement to defund, abolish the police, abolish the system, that we should have a more abolitionist approach to gun control regulations. I was wondering what your opinion is of the three approaches, or what your thoughts are, the way forward, and how the left should be thinking about analyzing this.
Well, my approach is strategic and tactical. I am not a pacifist. I do not necessarily rule out armed struggle against US imperialism at some point. But at the moment, and I say this after launching this project where I'm studying the Black Panthers and studying all of that armed resistance from the 1960s and early 1970s, that before that momentous decision is made, it seems to me we need more preparation. For example, minimally, there needs to be consultation with our friends and comrades in Cuba, because if you're talking about launching armed struggle, or even if you're talking about developing some sort of militia where you know that the authorities are going to come down on you with a ton of bricks, you really have to have your international house in order to be able to confront that sort of repression. I don't think we have our international house in order right now as of June 2022. So I think tactically, we should be pushing for disarming the right wing. We should be pushing for measures that would circumscribe the ability of these 18-year-old madmen to get weapons in their hands. And perhaps at another time, we can examine more carefully whether or not we need to adjust that particular outlook and go in a different direction. But as of now, given what I interpret to be the relative weakness of progressive forces, the fact, as your screen scroll tends to suggest, a number of our militants are still behind bars. A number of our most thoughtful and aggressive political prisoners still behind bars. I think that we should take account of that very fraught moment and try to generate the kind of gun control that once again would disarm the ultra right.
Yeah, I agree with that. And I guess my follow-up question would be, we've seen the gun control measures that have been implemented from the Munford Act all the way to Grandmaster Jay have mostly been used against Black communities. How does that add to your analysis?
Clearly, I mean, that act, which of course in California in 1967 led to the Black Panthers invading the legislature in Sacramento, which even led the NRA to call for a kind of gun control. And the fact of the matter is that we're going to have to fight a battle to make sure that our side is not disarmed while the ultra right wing is armed, which is basically where we are today. And so if we're pushing for gun control, I think what we always have to do, it seems to me, when progressive or radical forces are part of a larger coalition, is to bring clarity to the centrist and liberal forces and to bring a plus to the centrist and liberal forces. And the plus we would bring to this particular debate is insisting upon measures that focus like a laser beam on the ultra right, for example, and also measures that would tend to circumscribe the strength not only of the National Rifle Association by bringing lawsuits in states like California and New York against the National Rifle Association, but also the groups that are now springing up to the right of the NRA, such as the Gun Owners of America, for example. So I think we know that because that's the nature of settler colonialism going back centuries, that their priority is going to be to make sure that our side is disarmed. And it's up to us to see that at the appropriate moment, that particular priority fails miserably.
Yeah, and I guess on a much lighter note, the last question I have for you today deals with our competitor for in terms of who's watching our show is the NBA Finals, the Game 2. That's this show's major competitor. But what's your prediction for tonight's game and the NBA Finals overall?
Well, the record will show, and I can provide receipts, that weeks ago I predicted the Boston Celtics would prevail. And thus far, my wager is turning out to be true. And I think that's important because Boston has a rookie coach of West African descent, Ime Udoka, and he was a former assistant with the Nets, Brooklyn Nets, for example. There was controversy when he didn't get the Brooklyn Nets job. And I would speculate that when Darvin Ham, the Milwaukee assistant, Black American, got the LA Lakers job, that as coach, it may have had something to do with Udoka's success. And so I'm pleased with the Celtics. And then, of course, their key player, Jason Tatum, is from my hometown, St. Louis. And so as a St. Louis Patriot, I have to root for him and for the Celtics. And then Jaylen Brown, the other star of the Celtics, he's one of the most progressive athletes out there. I mean, I recall, I have vaguely in my memory bank the notion of him driving hundreds and hundreds and hundreds of miles. I think it was to Georgia to participate in Ahmaud Arbery protests. And of course, if I'm not mistaken, he comes out of Berkeley too. So there are many reasons for me to wish the Celtics well. setting aside, of course, the ugly history of Boston and how they maltreated and mistreated Bill Russell, their center from the 1960s to the early 1970s. And Bill Russell said he used to throw up before every game. Now, he said that it was just because of nervous tension, but I always thought it was having to deal with these races in Boston that caused so much tension that he had to regurgitate on a regular basis. So setting that aside for the moment, I'm wagering on the Boston Celtics triumph.
Yeah, and I think it was on the Carl Nelson show where you made that prediction, and I can attest, having listened to the show, that I recall you predicting the Celtics would win. Maybe it was a different show, but that's my recollection.
Oh yeah, I've been saying it all over the place.
And I can say, I'm as New Yorkers, we dislike Boston. So, but I dislike Steph Curry and the Golden State Warriors more. So I'm pulling for the Golden State to lose.
Oh, I see.
That's my hope.
I see.
Well, again, thank you so much for coming on the show again. It's the absolute pleasure learning from you and an honor to speak with you again, and hope to have you back again in the future.
Thank you for inviting me.